You didn't choose your brain. You didn't choose your parents. You didn't choose where you were born, or the experiences that first taught you how the world worked. And yet somehow, all of those things became you. Who you are. Your personality, your beliefs, your strengths, your insecurities, the things you're proud of, and the things you wish you could change. But how much of the person you are was really up to you? I think we like to imagine that there was one point where we took over. Childhood was done, and we became conscious enough to think for ourselves. But I'm not sure it works like that. Because by the time you were conscious enough to ask who the person you wanted to become was, there was already somebody there asking that question. You already had a temperament. You might have been naturally confident or anxious, outgoing or reserved. You had already spent years absorbing information about what was right and wrong, what success looked like, what you should fear and what you should believe, and what kind of person you were supposed to be. None of which means those things can never change, but it does mean that we don't begin from nothing. By the time we start consciously shaping ourselves, we're already working with a person that's partly been shaped. And obviously, some of that shaping comes from the environment we grew up in, but some of it seems to be there from the beginning, which brings us pretty quickly to the old question of nature versus nurture. How much of me came from biology, and how much came from what happened to me? And I'm not sure the two can actually be separated that neatly. Take curiosity. Maybe two people are born with the same tendency to question things, but depending on what they encounter, that curiosity could lead one of them towards science and another towards religion, or art, philosophy, conspiracy theories. The tendency might be similar, but what it develops into could be completely different. And the reverse is true as well. Two children can grow up in the same house with the same parents and still become two very different people because they weren't identical going into those experiences. Our biology affects how we respond to our environment, and our environment affects how those biological tendencies develop. So rather than nature or nurture, it seems to be more like a constant interaction between the two. But even genetics and upbringing don't capture everything, because then there are the things that just happen. A teacher who takes a particular interest in you, a conversation you happen to overhear, or a friend introducing you to an idea, meeting someone because you just happen to be somewhere at a particular time on a particular day. Things that almost seem meaningless when they're happening, but that years later, entire parts of your life can trace back to them. I studied biology. I went traveling. I met certain people. I came across ideas that changed what I believed. And eventually, I ended up here, making videos about them. But change just a few moments in that chain, and perhaps I become somebody very different. And I find that almost impossible to comprehend, because when we look backwards, our lives can feel strangely inevitable. This happened, and then this happened, and then I became this person. But none of it had to happen that way. It always makes me think of Loki, if you've ever seen that. All of those branching timelines. There's a version of you who said yes, and a version of you who said no. A version who sent that message, and one that didn't. A version who met that person, and another whose life never crossed theirs at all. Now, every one of those paths would contain different experiences, and those experiences would continue shaping the person living through them, which means that tiny differences at one point in your life could eventually produce enormous differences later on. And once you start really thinking about that, it becomes difficult to see the person you are now as the only person you could have ever become. But this is where things get a little complicated, because I don't believe we are just simply passengers. I've actively tried to change parts of myself. There are qualities I've tried to strengthen, and weaknesses I've tried to let go of. Someone who struggles with anxiety can go to therapy. They can understand it better, and hopefully learn to manage it. Someone who has only ever experienced one way of life can deliberately put themselves in front of different people, and perhaps become more understanding because of it. We can challenge our beliefs, change our habits, practice patience, try and become more compassionate. So clearly, what happens to us isn't the end of the story. We can influence what happens next. But there is another problem. Why did one person want to change while another didn't? Why does one person notice a flaw and work on it while someone else doesn't see it as a flaw at all? Even when we shape ourselves, the part of us doing the shaping seems to come from somewhere. And I think that might be the strangest part of it all. We seem to be able to participate in who we become without ever being completely responsible for the person doing the participating. And once you start thinking about this, another question becomes quite hard to avoid. How much credit can we give someone for doing something we think is worthy of praise? And on the other side, how much blame can we give someone for doing something wrong? And again, this gets quite complicated quite quickly. Imagine two people trying to become professional musicians. One has natural ability, supportive parents, access to lessons, good health, and perhaps the kind of temperament that makes practicing for hours easy. The other has less support, fewer opportunities, and finds the same discipline much harder. If the first person succeeds, of course their efforts still matter. They still practiced, they still made sacrifices, they still did something difficult, but they also didn't choose every condition that made that effort possible. So how much of the achievement belongs to them? And how much belongs to everything that helped create the person capable of achieving that? I don't think that means we should stop praising hard work or pretend achievement means nothing. It just makes the idea of being completely self-made much harder to defend. You can be proud of what you built without pretending you created every tool you built with it. And if that applies when we praise people, it raises a much harder question about blame too. If our values, our desires, our fears, our personalities, and even our ability to reflect on those things were shaped by ideas that we didn't have control over, where exactly does the responsibility begin? And this is where we inevitably start bleeding into free will, which is a much bigger question and one that I will leave to explore in a future video. For now, I'm comfortable leaving it unresolved because I don't need to know exactly how free we are to recognize that none of us created ourselves from scratch. And this whole realization has actually changed how I think about myself too, because honestly, I find some of it relieving. If I didn't choose every part of myself, perhaps I don't need to blame myself for every part either. That doesn't remove responsibility. If one of my traits causes harm, it still matters that I try to manage it. But there's a difference between taking responsibility for what you do next and condemning yourself for having the predisposition in the first place. You didn't choose your first anxious thought. You didn't choose to be naturally sensitive. You didn't choose which things would come easily to you and which you would have to fight much harder for. You can work on those things. You can try to manage them. You can try to become better. But maybe you don't need to treat every imperfect part of yourself as though you deliberately put it there. And I think there is something quite freeing in that. Maybe I am responsible for the person I've been given without being solely responsible for everything that made that person exist. And strangely, it also makes me feel better about decisions because I'm someone who can get very caught up in trying to make the right choice. You imagine one future and then another, and feel as though if you just think hard enough, you can somehow work out which entire life would be better. But you can't. You will never know the other version of your life where you made the other decision. Once you choose, that other path becomes something you can imagine, but not another life that you have to live. That doesn't make our decisions unimportant. They become part of everything that shapes us next. But there is something comforting in knowing that I only ever have to live one timeline. I can make the best decision I can as the person I am, with the information I have available to me now, and whatever happens after that becomes another part of the person making the next decision. So how much of who you are really was up to chance? Probably more than most of us like to admit. That doesn't mean that nothing's in our control, and it doesn't mean that our actions don't matter. It just means that we should hold our pride with a little more humility. Be grateful for the qualities and circumstances that have helped us. Be less cruel to ourselves for the things that we never chose, and pay closer attention to what we allow to shape us next. Maybe I didn't create every part of the person I am, but I am here with this mind, with this history, and whatever ability I have to participate in who I become next. Thanks for watching. Take care. Bye.